I'm Mr. Ramsey, saving Western civilization, one student at a time.
In our last lecture, we talked about the fall of Russia and the Romanov dynasty and how the communists had taken over Russia, causing them to drop out of World War I for the Allies. But as they dropped out, the United States in April of 1917 joined the war. Okay? And by the United States joining the war under Woodrow Wilson, the United States gave the Allies resources, both human resources and industrial resources, to help the Allies win the war against Germany and the Central Powers. It also caused an increase in morale with the Allied nations, and it was just in time because in April of 1917, you have French soldiers during the Passchendaele offensive actually mutiny, which means they're rebelling against their commanders. And that has happened right when the United States is actually entering the war. And I'll talk about the Passchendaele offensive in just a second because it was actually a disaster. But one thing the United States has to do under Woodrow Wilson is to bring supplies and men across the Atlantic Ocean. And what they do is they develop a convoy system. And that convoy system was to protect their shipping while hunting U-boats. And U-boats, of course, were German submarines. The United States was the only thing that the Allies were doing to help win the war. The British sent this guy named T.E. Lawrence to the Middle East, in particular the Palestine region, to actually have different Arab groups rebel against the Ottoman Turks and harass the Ottoman Turks. And what he did was he promised those Arab tribes independence. The problem with promising that, little did T. Lawrence know that the British and the French had decided to split up the Ottoman Empire after the war was over between themselves. So T. Lawrence didn't know that. T. Lawrence went over there promising the Arab tribes, if they rebel against the Ottoman Turks during the war, then the British would help them secure their independence. But what happens after the war is actually you have the Sykes-Picot Treaty, or Picot Treaty, which divides the Middle East between the British and the French. And another thing that the British did, they actually also, in the Balfour Declaration, declared Palestine actually a homeland for the Jews. Okay, so you have three promises that are going on simultaneously during the war. You have T. Lawrence promising the Arabs their independence from the Ottoman Empire. You have the British and the French dividing the Middle East between themselves. And then you have the British under the Balfour Declaration granting Jews a homeland. So just like in any war, you make so many promises and it's hard to keep them, because you'll worry about that after you win the war. You have to win the war first. Okay. So anyway, so those are the three things that happen. Anyway, so just talking about this war, the economies of all these war, which I talked about in a previous lecture, is total war. That means that they're directing all their people and resources to the war effort. And I mentioned the fact that the Germans called it war socialism. And because of this whole total war effort, several things happen. Number one, women start to take men's place in the factory. So you have, while the men are fighting in the war, you have women working the factories, okay, which is going to be a change of gender roles there, okay. Also, women are going to be nurses in the war, okay, and because of these more opportunities for women, the European governments are going to grant suffrage, or women's right to vote, in different countries. The United States does it in 1918. Actually, the British don't do it all the way until 1928. So, in addition to granting women to vote, to win the war, in this total war effort, the European colonies are promising their colonies that they'll grant them independence if they help them win the war. So colonial countries fighting with the Allies or fighting with the Central Powers or helping them being promised to get their independence. Of course, that was not happening as well. And because of the total war, and to boost morale, you have censorship of the press. So those are several things that happen. Number one, women's social roles change because women are in the battlefield and the women have to work the men are in the battlefield, the women have to work the factories. Number two, well, because of that, eventually European countries are going to grant suffrage to the women. Number three, colonial countries fight and want their independence. And then number four, we have censorship of the press. Those are four major things that happen as a direct result of World War I. Okay, so here's the situation that's going on in 1917. So Russia has dropped out of the war. The Germans have moved their forces from the Eastern Front to the Western Front to try to win the war. Okay? The French soldiers are mutiny because they're tired of this war. They've been in the trenches for 4 years. They haven't done anything. Okay? You have now this push by the Germans, okay? And the British fill in the gap, okay? And it's called the Passchendaele Offensive. And so this offensive is there's several of them, okay? But the last offensive is a push, of course, by our good friend General Haig. And General Haig has this massive plan in Passchendaele to basically win the war. Okay? He says that this counteroffensive is going to win the war. Okay? So General Haig's plan in the Passchendaele is to push the Germans all the way to the Belgian coast. And he has this great plan in September and October of 1917. And this is what the New York Times say. And this is from the book 1917 by Warren Carroll. Headlines in the New York Times report this day's action. Quote, British and French smashed through wide German front north of Pries. All Haig's objective gained. Attacks launched at dawn, with Allied airplanes cooperating effectively in a clear sky. Unquote. With the exception of, quote, attacks launched at dawn, unquote, not one word of those headlines were true. Just a month later, after the truly last assault on Passchendaele had been made, Lieutenant General Sir Lancelot Cargill, Chief of Staff to General Haig, finally paid a visit to the battlefield. I'm going to stop here for a second. Finally paid a visit to the battlefield. Not before the battle, not during the battle, at the end of the battle. Okay? So finally paid a visit to the battlefront. His first of the campaign. He was riding in a car on a road that was, for the moment, still passable. As he beheld the oozing hell all around the road, even before he reached the front, he broke down and wept. Good God, he cried. Did we really send men to fight in that? His driver turned to him a face of stone and spoke just 5 words. It's worse further up. 750,000 men were killed or wounded on all sides in the Passchendaele campaign. The greatest gain was 5 miles. Now, although the Passchendaele was a fiasco, it was the Americans that helped stop the German advance in July of 1918. The French, the British, and the Americans stopped the Western advance by the Germans under General Foch. Okay? And General Foch, by July, he starts to push the Germans back. As a matter of fact, he pushes them all the way back to the German border with the help of the Americans. And because the Americans helped in, because both the British and the French forces are tired, but because of this final push, the German generals know it's over. Okay? This is their last thing. They knocked out Russia. They put all their forces in the West. The Western Allies stopped them under the British and the French and the Americans. And the generals in September of 1918 tell Kaiser Wilhelm II that the war is over. There's nothing they can do. And during this time, by October, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire starts to fall apart, with different nationalities breaking apart the empire. And so on November 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicates his throne. And then on November 11th, the Germans sign an armistice on the basis of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points of peace without victors. And the German people, or the German soldiers, or the German generals are assuming that's the type of peace plan that's going to be enacted. And it's not going to be the type of peace plan. And so, just to let you know, during this war, on the Allied side, the Russians lost 1.7 million before they went into a civil war. The French lost 1.4 million dead. The British Empire, 1 million. The Italians, 650,000. The United States, who was only in the war from 1917 to 1918, lost 116,000. Serbia lost 48,000. Wounded Russian soldiers were 5 million. French soldiers on 4.3 million. The British soldiers wounded was 2 million. Italians, 1 million. The United States, 400,000. And Serbia, 143,000. For the Central Powers, you had the Germans, 1.8 million dead soldiers. For Austria-Hungary, 1.3 million dead soldiers. The Ottoman Empire, 325,000. And Bulgaria, 87,000. And wounded, Germany's casualties were 4.2 million. The Austrian-Hungarian, 3.6 million. The Ottoman Empire, 400,000. And Bulgaria, 152,000 wounded. So those are that's the disaster of World War I. Next time we'll talk about the Paris peace plan, with all Central Powers have to sign. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you.